It is an absolute pleasure to see you all here tonight for a conversation with and about living rivers. I'll just briefly introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Erin O'Donnell. I'm a senior lecturer here at the law school. My research focus is on the legal recognition of rivers as living entities and legal persons, which is happening around the world. The rights of nature is one of the fastest growing legal movements in the world. And right here in Australia, we have the first and Australia's so far only river to be recognised as a living entity. I will begin with an acknowledgement of country. So we are here on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung lands, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I acknowledge that they've never ceded their rights to care for these lands and waters. And the beautiful place that we enjoy today has come at an enormous cost to them. So part of this acknowledgement of country is acknowledging the terrible lasting impacts of colonisation that continue to affect people. And in line with that, I would also like to note that Ani Dai Kerr is an apology tonight because they have had a funeral today. They're undertaking sorry business this week. And the tragic death of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung man that they are now dealing with is another reminder of the ongoing violence of colonisation that is affecting Indigenous peoples here in Naarm and everywhere around the world. We can see examples of that everywhere in our news, so it is something that is a very live issue. So in this acknowledgement of country, I also acknowledge that here in Victoria we are hopefully starting to turn a page on some of this with the treaty negotiations. So I stand in solidarity and support with the Yurruk Justice Commission, and I hope all of you will be joining the Yurruk Walk for Truth at some point over the next few days. I'll be out there on Tuesday, so come and join in for that really important work and the work of the First Peoples Assembly as they progress towards Australia's first treaty with Indigenous peoples. Before I move into Shrishti's fabulous presentation today, I just wanted to set the scene a little bit with the idea of what a river as a living entity actually means. So the Birrarung, as I mentioned before, is Australia's first and, at this point, so far only river to be recognised in settler law as a living entity. So there's a couple of things in there that are really important. One is the living entity. So the Birrarung is alive. It is a living being with whom we are all in relation. And the second point that's really important there is that this is a recognition in settler law. So in 2017, the Victorian Parliament passed the Willipjin Birrarung Maron, or otherwise known as the Yarra River Protection Act. And this recognised the river as alive, but it is something that Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people have known for millennia. And I'm now going to do something that is a little bold, so bear with me, but I'm going to read you the preamble of the Willipjin Birrarung Maron Act. Willipjin Birrarung Maron is Woiwurrung language for keep Birrarung alive. So it is a call to action. How much stronger is it than Yarra River Protection Act, right? So the Woiwurrung language name is already asking us to do more, to act in relation with this river. Willipjin Birrarung Maron is also Victoria's first bilingual legislation. So its preamble in Woiwurrung says, Woiwurrung balak ba Birrarung wanganyinyu bikpil, Yarra Yarra pil manyi bik ba Birrarung, Ganbu maram nanganyu, manyi Birrarung maranjak, Darang ba marup wanganyingni, Naganun tuanbil, Birrarung wa nanbu, Willem nanganyu, nanbu nan, gananganyinyu, Maninyu Birrarung, Banjul manganyi bik, wuru wuru, Waranyi ba yalak, bar naganan tuan, Biku kolinyi, Maganyi banjul, War manakith nanganyin, Baliang banyumbanyu banjial, Banyu bargurk manganyi nan gananyu nanbu, Nielambik nielam kuni, Balatbik balat kulinyi, Balat manganyin manyi bik ba Birrarung, Balat manganyangin durungu ba murupu, ba nanbu maranjak. In English, that translates to, we the Woiwurrung, the first people, and the Birrarung belong to this country. This country and the Birrarung are part of us. The Birrarung is alive, has a heart, a spirit, and is part of our dreaming. We have lived with and known the Birrarung since the beginning. We will always know the Birrarung. Bunjil, the great eagle, the creator spirit, made the land, the sky, the sea, the rivers, flora and fauna, the law. He made Kulin from the earth. Bunjil gave Wa, the crow, the responsibility of protector. Bunjil's brother, Palyang, the bat, created Birrarung, women from the water. Since our beginning, it has been known that we have an obligation to keep the Birrarung alive and healthy for all generations to come. This is now the law in the settler state of Victoria, this obligation to protect the living entity of Birrarung. And the Act describes the river and its lands as being a single living integrated natural entity. So I'm now just going to do a quick question to say how many people here today have seen Birrarung as you've moved through Melbourne? Oh my God, so many. That's so great. And of course, you've all interacted with Birrarung because Birrarung makes our lives possible here in Melbourne. Birrarung keeps the water flowing out of our taps, keeps our showers clean, makes our lives possible. So, any of you who saw the beautiful living river today, did you say hello to it? Anyone feel brave enough? Yeah? Yeah? Yeah, there's always a couple of people. Yeah, Christina, of course. This is how we find our way in to this relationship with a living river, is to start acknowledging it as alive, starting to feel gratitude for all of the things that the river does for us, and starting to see the river as this living being with whom we are in relation. So have a yarn with Birrarung next time you're down there with the river. Connect with Birrarung, spend time with Birrarung, sing to Birrarung. Be with Birrarung as you would be with any other living being, because that's the law of the land. I'm now going to invite up our first speaker to join us to talk a little bit more about the exciting global nature of this recognition of rivers as living entities and legal persons. This has been a particular growth area since 2017. We've seen a lot of jurisprudence coming out of India that Shrishtee is going to share with us, but it's also a global phenomenon, and Shrishtee will talk a little bit about that as well. So I'm going to invite Shrishtee up while I just briefly give you a reminder of her fabulousness. So Shrishtee Bajpai is a researcher, writer and activist working on themes of interspecies justice, earthy governance and systemic transformations. She's a member of Kalpavrikrish, an environmental action group in India. I really should have got you to teach me to say that, and coordinates Vikalp Sangam, the Alternatives Confluence network that researches, documents networks around systemic alternatives. She's the core team member of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives and part of Emerging Futures Visionaries program of Joseph Rowntree Foundation. She also serves on the executive committee of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, and you can often find her looking at birds, insects, bees, and shamelessly photographing them. She can also be found trying to sing, scribbling thoughts, and collecting books to read. So, Shrishtee, thank you so much for coming to join us tonight, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Erin. Can you hear me well? Yeah? Okay. So, first of all, thanks everybody for coming here and making time. Really glad to see all of you for the very first time. And of course to Erin for inviting me here and all the work that she does. So, thank you everyone. So, I'll start with the river sings. Why I think that is important is because I would like to invite you today to not think so much, but rather feel. Because we do a lot of work from here and very little from here. So let's invite ourselves to listen from heart and listen from all other senses also in this space. And because also it's of course about legal rights and it's of course about all these institutions that we want to transform, but there's a lot more beyond that's happening. What Erin was saying, that just go and say hello to the river that nourishes us, that nurtures us. So I invite that feeling, that joy, that dependence that comes with being with these natural entities all around us, without whom it's difficult to live. And I also invite you to hear stories, because I think stories are very powerful. And in some ways, all these crises that we are facing today is a crisis of a story. Because they are a dominant story that's told to us that this is how the world has to be. And then there are other stories that never come to us, we don't hear them, they don't arrive. And so it's also about our openness to these stories and new forms and ways of knowing. And I'll start with my own story. So the picture that you see is from the city in Benares, where the river Ganga, Ganges flows. Ganga originates from Gangotri Glacier in the Himalayas and then flows through all of the Indian plains and then falls into the Bay of Bengal. And it's a magnificent river. I don't know how many of you have been to India and have seen this river. It's a gorgeous river, beautiful, travels 2,500 kilometers. I was born in the banks of the river Ganges in another city called Kanpur, which is where the river is most polluted. It is one of the most polluted cities in the world. And I think something happened to me there, which I only realize now, which is when you're born in cities like that, when you're experiencing a river that is a goddess, we revere it, we go and perform ceremonies, but then the river is polluted. It is desecrated in every conceivable way. And I think I never had an articulation to really say what was this starkest contrast that all humans are living with. But now I think I have, and I now realize that this is how we are as humans living in this world. And it's not just about my city, my people, but it is about all of us, that we live on this earth, we're dependent for our basic existence and survival, yet we have polluted our water sources, our mountains, our grasslands, our wetlands and ecosystems, and we continue to do so. And that could be the most starkest contradiction that we all live with. And so, while as a young child, I always found it extremely jarring that why would we do that to the river, I only later realized that there is a much larger picture to why we are doing this to the river. And one larger question that always kept me alive as a young researcher that got into then looking and finding answer to this very existential question, I'm sure many of you sitting in this room must be grappling with, as to why are humans doing this, you know? And is all of us are responsible for it? Or is it some people? Who are these people? Who does the decision making? Where are the institutions? Who is taking decisions in those institutions? What laws are a problem? And all of this brought me to a point where to look at these questions became even more important, as of course personally but also politically. And that took me to a fascinating landscape. I don't know if anyone of you sitting in the room has ever been to, but this is the Trans-Himalayan landscape that adjoins, and it's also an extremely fascinating landscape because it's the Trans-Himalayas. So these are older than Himalayan mountains, and it's a cold desert. So again, a fascinating biodiverse area. And this is where the Indus River flows. I guess many of you would have heard of it, the Indus River. If not, it's one of the oldest rivers in the world, but also home to the oldest civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, that emerged from here, but also other parts of Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan. Now, what's fascinating about this river is that it's known as Nilab in Afghanistan. It's known as Singhe Khababs in Ladakh, where the photo is from. It's known as Sindhu in Pakistan. And it's known for very different names because of the magnificence of the river. It's not a river. People call it the sea. So it's so huge. Once upon a time, it was so huge, so big that it was a sea. Well, coming to the main part of the story, is that I was talking about, things like rights of rivers, and I was speaking to young students in a government school and asking them, what do you think are rights of rivers? You guys have rights, do rivers have rights, and yada yada yada. And then one young girl, very shy young girl sitting at the back said, well, I think the river has a right to sing. And I was really surprised that why would she say that the river has a right to sing? And then I was surprised by my surprise, because who but a young girl living along the banks of the river, not yet completely brainwashed by modern systems of education, could actually see and listen to the river. Because she lives along the river every day. and she's dependent on the river. And of course, I probed a little bit more as to why does she think that river has a right to sing, and how does she know that? And then she gave a pretty scientific answer also. She said that because the river has so much flow, and it then hits the stones, and the birds moves around it, and so all that sound that it makes, then the river has a right to sing. And of course, if it doesn't make that sound, then she's not alive. And that took me by surprise, because these kids had never heard about any of this rights and all of that framework. So it is this embodied way of knowing that communities have always lived with, have always had, which is getting increasingly lost in our modern education and the way then we relate to the river. And it has been such an important source of sense-making, meaning-making, and this comes from the Northeast India, again, a fantastic landscape, where the Indigenous community has been protesting against a massive hydropower project in the downstream region. And one of the main important reason for protest by the Lepcha Indigenous tribe there is that the river carries their stories of origin. So if you dam the river, you dam our stories. And so Milkit Lepcha, one of the storytellers from the community, says that it's not just about what the river means to us in terms of our livelihoods, our lands, etc., but it's about really who we are. So our stories of origin are lost if the river is left. And how many of us sitting in the room can say that about us? That our stories of origin, of who we are, will be lost if a river is lost. And that is an important point to question as to why that has happened. Because there's no reason that it should have happened. But many of us have lost that. And that brings me to this another example, again from the northeast of India, where the Dimasa people believe that they are the children of the big river. So Dimasa means children of the big river, literal translation. And this big river is Brahmaputra that flows from China and then enters huge parts of India, and it's again a gorgeous, magnificent river. And for me, what is important here is that much of our language, and especially the language right now you and I are speaking in, has lost this sense of what it is to connect with nature. So we have lost the words about nature, about ecosystems, about biodiversity. And that is a very important loss that we feel maybe sometimes, but we are not able to articulate. What does that loss really mean? When we have lost the language of how do we connect with nature? What does it mean to have rest of nature as alive? What does it mean to feel like children of the big river? And if the river is lost, dammed, then what does it happen? What happens to the children? How do they exist? And all of these sense of meaning making, of our own existence and survival is lost somewhere because our language has become a language that is extremely devoid of this relationality, devoid of this reciprocity that all of us have to live with. And that's why we don't see landscapes anymore as these beautiful magical entities. The same region where the river Indus flows in the Trans-Himalayan landscape, people have certain restrictions, certain limits, and I'm sure it's also in parts of Australia where Aboriginal people live, that they believe that all these lands are occupied by guardian spirits. And so there are some places that humans can go and access, but there's also some places where we don't belong. We cannot go, we must not go. And that's how the conservation and protection of these landscapes happen. Because there's a belief that it's not just humans who are living in these landscapes. It is occupied by so many other beings, and we must respect, and we must put restraint in ourselves. And so many indigenous cultures and communities have always had the sense of restraint, that we don't go certain places, we don't occupy certain mountains, we don't have to reach the summit of all the mountains. We can be in a certain place and we cannot be in certain places. So I think those were important rules, important ways of being and dwelling that put respect for the world that is unknown, for the beings and the landscapes that we don't know. And this was the most profound, actually transformative experience for me as I started my journey into this work was when I was working with Central Indian tribes in India. And this elder Sumaru fellow, I asked him that, so they have been protecting their sacred forest against a mining project. And when I asked him that, why don't you go to the city, get these jobs that the mining company is offering, you'll have better access to health facilities, roads, etc. And he said, which was extremely transformative, he said, I can go to a city, but what happens to the spirits in the forest? What happens to the birds and the animals in the forest? So it's not just about my livelihood, it's about a more than human community. And so it's not about just humans and we take our decisions and we want better roads, but the voice of the voiceless, who brings that? And I think that as even an environmental advocate, researcher, was extremely transformative because I saw what really their vision of a community was. And for many of us living in modern context, that sense of that a tree, a mountain and a river is also part of the community is so difficult to imagine. And that's why most of our decisions are always alienating them and they're never including them. And so, for me, what is important is how do our legislations, institutions, and transformations in general become alive to this question of what does it really mean to include the rest of nature more than human world into our decision making. And it has been possible. I'm speaking mostly from the Indian context, but I'm sure you all will give examples from various other contexts. And this photo that you see is from 35 years ago. From central India, where a dam was coming up on the Birrarung river, which is the river that you see on the screen, and the Gond community, which is the indigenous communities in central India, formed this human chain, and they said for developers, for hydropower project developers, this river is how many megawatts of energy she produces, but for us, river is our mother. And that and many other such movements during 1970s and 80s in India led to transformative changes in our laws and policies, which had never happened right after the British left. Many of these laws and policies were still very much in the colonial setup, and many of these movements then informed what does it really to bring the voice of the more than human into our legislations and policies and other such departments. But frankly speaking, nothing much changed really, and I'll come to that as to why. But just to highlight also from the city that I live in the western part of India, in Pune, a lot of movement, as Erin was sharing, that's happening here in Melbourne. Also, a lot of movement is also happening in cities and urban spaces where people are questioning the way our lives are organized in cities, and people are asking fundamental changes. And here, a lot of citizens got up and said that we don't want roads that would have gone into, if you see those trees there, there's a lot of mountains, small hills in the city, and a massive four-way highway was going to go into those, destroy these small hills and go into these forests. And citizens got together, they said that we know there's a lot of traffic problems and other such things, but we need dungs in the city, and so we need these forests. And they've been also very active in protecting the river, which is, I was telling Erin this morning that they're going through what is called as the new idea of beautification of the river. So the rivers are concretized, or their banks are concretized. All the forest around the river is cut down because we are beautifying the river and concretizing. So some weird logic that bureaucrats and developers live with. So a lot of citizen groups are asking the question about that if we have the right to live, so does our rivers and forest. But there's something fundamentally awful about, especially in the context of India, I must say, that the rivers are extremely sacred in our text, in our ways of being, and we revere them. And so going back to the same question as to why then they are polluted, why do you see that destruction in the same river, the Ganges, this kind of beautification project that's coming up, or the interlinking of a lot of rivers happening. So all of these very anti-ecology of the river kind of decision making happening. Why is this happening? And from the analysis of a lot of things, I don't know if any of you know what is happening here. Can anybody make a guess? Yeah?
It's come from pollution. It's come from pollution.
Yes. You wanted to do it?
I was going to say purification. I need to go into the river to purify.
Yes. So this is the most this captures everything. So this guy is there in the river. There's a very important ceremony that is performed inside the river, and this river has got it. All that foam is coming from the industry pollutant, and so what does this really mean? To live like that, to pray for a river that is this polluted, and this is Yamuna River in Delhi. And I think for us it is important to look at what does sacredness and secularity really means in all of these contexts. And some sense of this larger crisis that we face today is one that despite the sense of sacredness for the rivers, our bureaucracy and institutions still pretty much work in the same logic that the colonial governments worked in, which is looking at rest of nature as a resource. So even if River Ganga is sacred to us, we would still need to engineer it to make it possible for humans and for human use. So the logics itself, for example, the role of wildlife department, forest department, everybody works with the same logic that the rest of nature is a resource to be appropriated, extracted, and made best use of. Also, there's big regulatory failure. Despite the promise of decentralization in many parts of India, what has happened is that much of the decision making happens in a centralized way, which is coming from the same pretty much logic that local people don't know what's best for them. So bureaucrats sitting in Delhi or Bombay know what is good for somebody in Trans-Himalayas, where they have no sense of what the ecology of that region is, how do mountains in, at 40 degrees Celsius, how can you make decisions where it is minus 30 degrees Celsius? I mean, that logic doesn't work, but that's how most of the bureaucracy and governance happens. The third is this fetishness to neoliberal growth model, and a lot of the global south is facing that, because there's a certain way that the West has gone, and that has happened only because they have passed certain stages of progress, and so now the rest of the world needs to also go through those stages of progress to be like the West, So we still pretty much work with the same fetishness. And there's a limit to judicial activism, which I'll share with you about in context of rights of nature, but in general of how limited judiciary can be in terms of transforming anything significantly at the grassroots. And the fifth one, which I might not have so much time to expand on, is that conservation is construed as environmentalism, and pretty much that's what is needed to do something for the environment. And that again comes from the Western logic, which is that you create more protected areas, sanctuaries, you create enclosures, remove people from those areas, and that's what is enough to do your environmental work. And much of, again, bureaucracy and departments work with that logic. And that has resulted into displacement of a lot of people. And so that's where something like rights of nature comes in, which is that most of the current laws and policies that we have in India, but also in many other parts of the world, are actually, and in this term, environmental laws and policies, are actually used as means to sanction environmental destruction rather than actually protect environment. So it makes it easier for corporations and companies to actually get in and destroy rather than actually protect the environment. And the kind of ecological and climate crisis we are living in, we cannot continue with the same laws and policies. So we need a fundamental shift into how we see the rest of nature itself, and which in that sense is connected to signaling a shift from an extractive property-oriented mindset to a rather very different one, which I've been trying to highlight all through the earlier slides, to one where indigenous peoples and other nature-dependent communities, because in India we also have fisher folks, farmers, are very much dependent also on land and rivers and ecosystems, who have always had these cosmologies of reciprocity, interdependence, relationality as part of their worldview. And so that needs to somehow come into laws and policies. But the challenge is, how do we do it really? And as Erin was saying, that it is happening across the world. We don't have the time really to get into all of these, and many of you might already be aware, sitting in this room, I guess. But there's so much happening across the world, like literally every day something or the other keeps happening, and it's difficult to keep up. And lots of very innovative stuff as well, so it has been an interesting trend to notice. But also, I'll share some examples where I think are relevant to the Indian context because the judgments that came in India, it got inspired a lot from some of those. But just to highlight that there are certain approaches broadly, there could be more, but my analysis is this, that there are broadly 4 approaches to the rights of nature movement. One focused on earth-centered governance, which is where my own sense of work lies, which is thinking about governance in a much more holistic sense, or what does it mean to imagine it from the more than human perspective. There's also, of course, constitutional approach, which is amending the constitution that happened in Ecuador, where rights of nature were guaranteed. There's, of course, indigenous and relational approach, where many indigenous communities, through their customary laws and practices, have passed either their own ordinances or judgments wherein they recognize rights of nature. And the fourth is a very pretty much obvious one, judicial approaches, where judgments are passed in the court of law. And so, keeping those in mind, I want to highlight these. I know most of you might know about them, but just to say what has been an important inspiration for the context in India. So, Tiviawatupa Act that was passed in New Zealand, with Ganga River and ecosystem being recognized as having legal rights, was an important one because of the struggle of the indigenous peoples, and also because a lot of the essential elements of the judgment were copy-pasted by the Indian judgment. So that became an interesting judgment to look at when we started analyzing our own judgment of what it means. And most essentially to find a lot of similarities to the context that we are living in, but also some differences. And it became important to see what led to something like this to happen after so many years of struggle, but also to see what were the ideas of custodianship, how do we share, who speaks for the river, and how do we share that responsibility, became an interesting thing to look at. The Aturatu River one in Colombia again became an important example to look for, is especially because of a connection with the voice of the indigenous peoples coming in, but also essentially using another legal tool, not just legal personhood, but here what they thought for was biocultural rights, which was again an interesting element to engage with, because there are limitations to legal personhood in many contexts, but especially in the Indian context, because rivers are not persons, they are goddesses. So you cannot accord personhood rights to rivers that are for people, goddesses. So in that sense, it's a challenge that, of course, legal challenge that many of us face, but also in terms of what does it mean to think about this question much more holistically. And Ecuador is a very interesting example for us to look at. One, because of also the transformative aspects in the constitution that enabled it to more powerfully being recognized in any country's system, and also being informed by the conception of what well-being is for the indigenous concept of good living. But also because it has had such a long period of looking at the impact and what it means, you can see the contradiction that all of us are living with. So even if you recognize rights of nature formally in the constitution, you have progressive left government that promises rights of indigenous peoples and transformations. If fundamentally the neoliberal growth model doesn't change, nothing really changes. So that's an important example for us to look at in general for the transformative potential of many of these, legislations. These are some important, I think for me, important documents of reference for a lot of these things. And now we come to India, and now I have 5 minutes, so let's see how this goes. So, in 2017, the Uttarakhand High Court, which is one of the North Indian states, passed a judgment recognizing the rights of the river Ganges and its originating glaciers as that of a living being. And this was the first time in ecological jurisprudence in India where this had happened. In 2018, again, the same court ruled that the entire animal kingdom has rights. Then in March 2022, one of the neighboring courts ruled that a lake in the city of Chandigarh, which is one of the North Indian cities, also has rights. And then in 2022, one of the South Indian states, Madras High Court, ruled that the entire earth is a living being. So there are some interesting cases emerging in India. I don't have the time to go into all of this, but we looked at the first case that happened, and quite intently as people were working on river issues with dependent communities, that what does it really mean for the river to be recognized as a legal person? In the court of law, that means your injury can be recognized, you have the right to sue, it can be sued. But what does it mean for a river? What are the rights and liabilities of a river? Who speaks for the river? What is the role of local communities? What happens when the river's rights are violated? Who gets the compensation? Who gets, how does the restitution process happen? But most fundamentally, what is a river? And court did not answer any of these questions that are most fundamental to really apply this law or apply this judgment, sorry, not law, apply this judgment in the grounds truths. But it really didn't get into that. So we tried doing it because we wanted to petition the Supreme Court, which is, so this judgment, the Uttarakhand High Court judgment was challenged by the state government, saying that this is completely crazy. How are you supposed to do this? And then the river flows into Bangladesh. How are we supposed to govern that? This is not possible. And so it was put on the state, but then you could go to the High Court. And so we were trying to draft this petition, and I'll tell the story if we get the time as to why we did not do that. But for us, it was important to then get into thinking about what is a river. And for us, which is the definition, I'm sure you guys can read it, was to look at the river much more broadly than any court of law or any judgment was going to define. And that means a lot more essential elements to go through, which includes the human communities, which includes the catchment areas, which also includes the moisture in the air and the groundwater. And that makes it a lot more complex, of course, but actually meaningful in terms of really doing certain transformations. And so, doesn't mean that it puts end to fishing, subsistence-based fishing or farming, but rather how do we include human rights and nature rights? Because that is most essential. When we talk about rights of nature, they are not separate from human rights. It becomes actually quite important to look at these issues. And broadly, I think the issues of anyway transboundary governance, especially in the context of the countries that we are living in, India's sharing borders with Pakistan, China, Bhutan, Nepal, and so we cannot think about rivers from human-made borders or any of the natural entities from human-made borders perspective. We have to really think about it from a perspective of respecting the continuity of nature. It never really follows any human-made boundaries. So how do we think about change our perspectives around that? And of course, the essential issues of it will come later, but to highlight that we need to question the roots of the crisis that we are living in. And then again going back, so I'm just circling back to all the essential elements of things, which is that we need to question this complete fetishness to development at all costs, and nature can be uprooted for it. We have to question, of course, the authoritarian political governments that are coming across the world, but also how do we bring in the various ways that communities have actually managed, controlled, and lived with ecosystems. So bringing in the plurality of many of the decision and governance systems into our laws and policies. And actually, rights are not an end. They are actually means towards larger end. And that is very important for us people working on rights of nature movement to realize, but also how do we move towards more systemic transformations that are actually questioning colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy in its most fundamental ways. Because that's when we go to the roots of why we are in the mess that we are in. And if we don't go to the roots and the bottom of it, we will never be able to solve the mess. It will just, we remove some dirt and the garbage from the river, but where is the essential problem emerging from? We never go into that. So I think for us, it is important to look at the interconnections and the cross-sectorality of our work. So maybe my work is somewhere here of ecological integrity and resilience. 1 minute. Yes. But it is also about thinking about how do we transform our economies. So we cannot go on with the same extractive economy. It's also about thinking who is the most deprived and who faces the most when actually a river is dammed. It's the community, so social justice because it's an essential element of it. And whose knowledge comes into play here? Whose knowledge that is produced in academic institutions or scientific institutions plays a more important role, or a farmer, or a fisherman, or somebody else who doesn't maybe have a degree, but is still very much living with the law of the land and knows a lot. So how can we actually question these power imbalances and really talk about a much more intersectional and holistic form of transforming the world? And we might be wherever we are in different, very different contexts, but there are certain common values that you saw in this. There's a center of values, and I think those values are the most essential that connect us to who we are as humans. So despite the differences, there's a value for respect for nature, harmony, reciprocity, joy, all of that I think all of us relate to despite our different contexts. So how do we nurture those values and interconnections? And there are many, many alternatives across the world. If this map makes you a bit uncomfortable, sit with that discomfort, because there's no reason why it's the other way around. But it's also to realize that there are just so many examples from across the world of these possibilities and alternatives that we need to hear. And as I was saying, I don't have time to go into these beautiful stories, but these are stories from across the world of possibilities where people are keeping these worldviews alive. And so it's a question of story, as I started, and I will end with that, which is to say that let's find what is this new story. And this, I'm not sure what happened there with the image, but it's a story where for me the important question is that does nature have agency? And we've always grappled with this question, and I'm still grappling, so there's no answer that I'm trying to offer here. But really thinking about how do we hear and listen to nature? You know, the presentation is titled "Listening to," session is titled "Listening to Rivers," and for me that is the most important question. And again, from the Trans-Himalayan landscape, I asked this old gentleman as to why and how climate is changing. What is his reason? And he says, if the spirits of the mountain and snow are unhappy, how can humans be? And for me, is this still a question as to how do we listen to those spirits? And what can enable us to really listen and to really think about? And something that's emerging from a lot of conversations with different people, but especially communities and Indigenous groups that I work with, is that something very powerful that again was told to me was that when we think about rights, we forget to think about what is our responsibility. And so very important essential elements to start thinking about rights is to start thinking about what as individuals our responsibility are. And I think our responsibility in this current crisis is about finding our sense of place, rootedness, as to where and why is our river polluted, and how am I connected to my river? Where is my water coming from? Where is my food coming from? And how is that being impacted? All these questions become very important. And the sense of attention deficit lives that we are living in, radical attention becomes even more important to have. And also, of course, this sense of standing with the communities that are most deprived, and so an entangled sense of empathy and responsibility is our responsibility to be present in this world. And resisting this mechanistic, extractive, and extremely utilitarian mindset also, which has come to sort of question everything that we do in our lives other than thinking. So how do we also revive that in us? And for me, then storytelling becomes an important part, which has been an important part for communities across the world. But how do we tell more such stories is just to understand that there's so many other ways of being in the world and doing things, and all must be respected and nurtured and celebrated. So how our differences don't become barriers, but rather celebration of different ways of being in the world. So thank you for being a patient audience and a very patient moderator.
I'm going to try and turn mine on. Thank you so much, Shrishtee. I think you've given all of us so much to think about and to try and put together in our own lives. That idea of entangled empathy and responsibility that's going to be something I'm going to think about And I think the challenge for all of us to take away from that particularly is that question, what is your story? How do you tell the story of your relationship with rivers and with the lands and waters that nurture you? Thinking about that, I think, is a really great place to begin. I'm thrilled to see that generated that level of conversation and engagement. So hang on to all those thoughts. We're going to have now a quick conversation between the panellists and also with you guys, and then we're going to open it up for a Q&A session with you guys as well. We'll have a roving mic going around. So to get us started, I'm going to introduce our fabulous panel. So we're being joined by Melissa Kennedy, who's a Tati Tati woman from Murray River Country. She's a PhD candidate at Monash University, a research fellow in water policy and social science at University of Melbourne, and a senior Atlantic fellow for social equity, a global community collaborating across borders and disciplines to address the root causes of inequity. Mel's pretty busy. We're really lucky to have her here. Mel's research focuses on centering better understanding and documenting the relationship between people, water and well-being to enable policy change and enduring transfers of power. Mel is also director of Tati Tati Nation, an Indigenous owned and operated non-profit conservation organisation that applies place-based Indigenous ecological science to heal waterways and land. Thank you for joining us, Mel. I'm also going to introduce Charity. Charity Mosienyane is passionate about all things water. She is a civil and environmental engineer who has delivered strategic plans for water security as well as civil infrastructure projects across Australia. She's the lead convener for Regen Melbourne's swimmable Birrarung Earthshot, a wild and ambitious vision to see the lower reaches of the Birrarung Yarra River swimmable again by 2030. The Earthshot seeks to unlock the power of collective action to transform the river to a health, thriving and swimmable once again state. Charity looks forward to the day when she can swim in the Birrarung after a day in the office, as do we all. It's very exciting work. So I'm now going to hand over to my fellow panellists and we've got some questions for each other to draw out some of the threads of the conversation that we've been enjoying today. And hopefully this will also inspire some questions for the rest of you as well. And so I think, Shrishtee, we will start with you.
Yes. So, well, I met Birrarung River this morning and I'm so grateful for that. And Erin took me. And I want to know, how does this reflect the rights and interest of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung, if I'm pronouncing it right, and sorry if I'm not, and what does it mean really for the river to be alive, and how do you listen to what the river is saying, and
Yeah, I think it is the first time that Settler Australia has had to grapple with this, and I'm certainly not going to speak for Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung, but I think it's important for us to have this conversation about their rights and interests, because they were really behind the recognition of the river as a living entity in settler state law. So this is, there was a long program of work, and Yarra Riverkeeper is here in the audience tonight, and they were one of the originators of the legislation that we now have. But it was Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung's advocacy consistently that led to the recognition of the river as a living entity in law. And this reflects their laws for the river. So it's a way of seeing the law of the settler state come closer to the laws of Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people. So it's not a full reflection of their rights and interests, but it's a way for the settler state to say, we see and recognise and respect the way that Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung see this river and have known this river for tens of thousands of years. So it is such a crucial first step, and it's a first step not because of the powers it bestows on Wurundjeri, but because, as you spoke about, it's the transformative beginning for all of us, particularly settler people like me, to actually start thinking very differently about what the river is. And I think that's the invitation for all of you to start thinking differently about the river. And I think in terms of understanding what the river is saying, I think this again goes to the points that you were making about an embodied way of being and that connection to place. So one of the hats that I wear is that I'm a member of the Birrarung Council, and so we are the voice of the river in settler law. And so we had to think very hard about how do we understand the river. And one of the reasons that I wanted to put my hand up to be on the council was that I wanted to be able to build a more intimate and connected relationship with the river. And I think for me, that's the answer. How do we know what the river is saying? Is we spend time with the river and we see the river as a living being with agency, and we start to see how it expresses itself. I only have the tiniest of insight. Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people are bringing tens of thousands of years of being with this river. But yeah, I think that's how we get to know rivers. And that then brings me to my question to Mel, which picks up on the themes that I kind of began tonight with, which is the themes of invasion and colonisation. And so if we can hear rivers by spending time with them and being intimate with them and connected to them, we need to acknowledge that invasion and colonisation have made it so much harder for Indigenous people to maintain that connection and to keep being with rivers. So how are you connecting to your waters?
Yeah, thanks, Erin, for the question. It's a big one when you think about the context of colonisation that's ongoing, and the ongoing theft of water from Indigenous lands. For the work that I do and my journey, sort of across the last 10 years almost, I'm very fortunate that I still live on my country. So I get to see my river every day. I get to keep reinforcing my relationships with my river every day. But a lot of Indigenous people don't. And where I can, I try and facilitate that reconnection. And so we created our own conservation organisation that focuses on re-veg work and also cleaning up our waterways. And so that was kind of a first step that we took, where we realised this is important work. And our mob who didn't live on country, who maybe lived in cities, we have a lot of family that live in Melbourne or in rural New South Wales. And so realising how important it was to them to be coming back on country, to their grandparents' country, to places that they feel in their bones that they don't necessarily get to revisit unless we were doing this type of work. I think that's what kick-started my academic and sort of policy work that I do, because there's only so much you can do on the ground, and that on-ground stuff is just as important. You've got to start from the bottom up, but you've also got to go from the top down. And so we still do all of that work. Our conservation org is doing well, and again, I was fortunate that I could step away from my role within that org, and it's still thriving. And so I've now got the time and space to work at a higher level, I suppose, with trying to make changes and be able to allow that connection and the reconnection to occur for First Nations peoples. But one of, I guess, the surprising changes for me is that I've realised the reconnection needs to be with non-Indigenous people and rivers as well. The fact that there is a disconnect, I think, is what perpetuates the ongoing degradation of our waterways. It's why exploitation exists. Because if you don't have a relationship with place, if you don't have a relationship with water, then exploitation is meaningless to you. You don't understand what is happening to that place. And so if there's no connections between the water that comes out of your tap or out of your showers to where that comes from, how are you going to hold yourself accountable to making change? You're not. It's not your problem. You're not part of it. There's no connection there. And so I think in the recent work that I do, it's about relationality and how to really bring people into the conversation in a way that makes people feel included and that they have the agency to feel these things and to feel connections to rivers, and that it's not just an Indigenous concept, and that it's not offensive if you say, I have a relationship with my river. I think a lot of non-Indigenous people are really worried about what they can and can't say and can and can't feel, because, we don't want to overstep, we don't want to offend, and there's this long history that we've had, and everyone knows about how Indigenous peoples have been treated poorly. But in the context of caring for our rivers, we all have to be in a relationship. So, yeah, I think if that doesn't exist, then it's going to be really, really difficult to get that change at the policy and the legislative level that we need to start improving some of our waterways, which is why I love this idea of swimmable rivers. And again, you know, I'm from the Murray River, I'm from Murrumbidgee, I have connections to Barker. These aren't healthy rivers by any means, but I still would swim in my river. And so to think about the Birrarung and to think about the pollution that it's experienced and to think about the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong and the Waterscapes and all of the mobs around here that, you know, this is their river and not being able to swim in it, that is the most devastating thing that I could imagine for my life personally. So yeah, I'm interested in hearing more about how you're bringing that relationship back to Melburnians and the wider communities, and how using swimmable rivers as that connection point, you can see some change really happening there.
Thanks, Mel. Yeah, like I think swimmability is such a it's such a relatable thing, right? You just shared what that means to you, and I'm sure each and every one of you would have a story about what swimmability means, and the joy, the family, the friends, all those moments in time you've had, the memories you have around water. And I think most people in the beginning, when we started this work at Regen Melbourne, when I said my job is to work with everybody. This is about everybody, the collective. This is about every Melburnian, Victorian, decision maker, First Nations. It doesn't matter what brand we put on ourselves or hat, but it's about everybody collectively working together, sharing resources to make the river healthy and thriving again. People would laugh at me because most people's experience, at least in the city, is seeing the brown, muddy river, e-bikes, whatever those lime bikes are thrown in the river. People have a really adverse reaction to it. But when you start tapping into what is your memory of swimming or being in water, you know, you see the curiosity. When you start showing people images of what's possible, people are like, oh, maybe. And then people want to know, why isn't it swimmable? Why is it polluted? Why do I respond this way? And I think swimmability just opens the door. It's an invitation to have the conversation about what is the health of the river? What does the river need? How do we start building relation with the river? What does care look like for the river? I was talking to a storyteller today, and so I come from an engineering background, so technical is my world, and I know there are a couple of friends in the room. I've had to learn to translate my language to something that's accessible. And I said to her, imagine if the river could have that holistic doctor's appointment, a medical check. What would the river say to us? Like, what would it say to us? And then how would we respond? And I think that's part of the invitation of what the swimmability movement is doing. It's saying, let's understand it, let's listen to it. There's sections, like, it's like some parts are singing, all parts are singing. Are we hearing that song? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's all of that. Let's create pathways to actually connect to the river so we can care for it. And that's what it's all about. And if we get to swim in it, that's great. But if we don't, imagine a thriving river where non-human species are just thriving again, and we have this lush vegetation, flora and fauna, aquatic and terrestrial, doing the thing, humans and non-humans in coexistence. How exciting is that? Yeah. Oh, thank you. I've got a lot of questions for you, but I want to pace myself, because I know everybody probably has quite a few questions to ask you, but thank you for your presentation earlier. I took lots of notes. But the question I'm really curious about is, you have this incredible, rich, very deep experience in one of the most magical places in the world. And I'm really curious about, I understand you've only been here for a couple of hours, if not a few hours, but what advice do you have for us in Australia? What are the things you can share? You've shared a lot of things, but like having conversations today, the research you've done, yeah. What stories and what advice do you have for us, and where do you see like opportunity as well?
So you're right, I have not even spent 24 hours here. And I would not do what colonizers did, to give advice too soon. So I will refrain from an advice, but I think I would say that it's exactly what you're doing, right? Creating the possibility of connection with the river, or the possibility of paying attention. For me, like I was saying about my own personal story of looking at the pollution, I think sometimes that could be profoundly transformative. The beauty is transformative, and so is the destruction, and especially for young people. Because there's some sense of, when we see destruction and when we see trauma, it reminds you of something in you. And that opens up a lot of possibilities. Just seeing the pollution of the river. We don't have to do too much. We don't have to experiment too much, but just, I have seen that with young people that we have gone for river walks, we've just shown them how the river is polluted. And just the piles of garbage, the piles of plastic that comes from the banks of the river just does something to them. And I think that's the most profound ways that we can change. Because having both these contrasting worlds exposed to young people creates the possibility of change of the heart. And I think that's where the things need to change, not necessarily of what and exactly how institutions transform or whatnot. That happens later. But I think something needs to change in your heart. And Rabindranath Tagore, who was one of the most important literary figures in India from West Bengal, spoke about Padma River, on whose bank he used to live. And he said that Padma River, when flooded, I paid respects to her. Padma, when receded and was flowing very slow, I paid my respects to her. Padma, when came downpouring to my house, I paid respects to her. I'm just noticing Padma, just experiencing Padma. So I think that is very important, just experiencing the world and rivers, mountains, seascapes, landscapes, whatever it is. I think we have lost that sense of experiencing. So the work that you guys are doing is an extremely important work in leading those transformations to happen. For people to be able to experience the river and see the river, I think can change a lot of things. That is the beginning of more changes in institutions and other such things. So I'll stop now.
I think that brings up a really important point, because one of the things that surprised me, and I was also surprised at my surprise when I stopped to think about it, was that when we look around the world, and there are so many rivers that now have this status of living entity or legal person or the subject of legal rights, they are all rivers that have been heavily impacted by human activity, particularly by colonial or Western capitalist activity. But it's the connection that people feel anyway. And it's that honesty and that intimacy and that willingness to imagine not just a better future and a different future for ourselves and the river, but that connection that is there now, and the honesty that comes with recognising the state of the river as it is, I have a very talented friend in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Elizabeth McPherson, who likes to talk about the fact that if we see rivers as family, then you don't stop loving your family when your family is sick. But you don't pretend that they're not sick either, right? You don't hide from that. You acknowledge it as a reality, but it doesn't undermine the relationship that you have with your loved ones. The love is still there. And so I think that's one of the things that I take from the experience of so many communities around the world, is that rivers remain beloved even when they're sick. I think, sadly, that is where we're going to have to end it, but I think that's a wonderful note to end on, because it's a challenge to all of us to keep planting the small seeds of change, to not be afraid of what looks like mere symbolism. So Birrarung as a living entity doesn't have legal rights, it can't go to court, but it is a powerful and transformative symbol. It invites all of us to think differently about this river and our relationship with it, to actually articulate what our relationship is with this river. So, for homework, for all of you, you didn't realise you were going to get any, thank you for coming out tonight. Please do some homework. Go home and think about, how would you explain your relationship with Birrarung? If you live in Melbourne, if you connect with this river, and many of you do, or you see it, see if you can just describe what your relationship actually is with this river, and be honest about it. Like, our relationships aren't great right now. But if you can write that down, what is your relationship with this living river? Then you can start to think, how would I like it to change? And so on that note, I'm going to say thank you to our amazing panel. Thank you to Shrishtee for travelling so far and sharing your insights with us. And thank you all of you for coming out tonight. Thank you very much.
Yes,